What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Valley coming at you with a solo podcast episode. It will be a one-question episode. The very quick reminder, though, if you're watching or listening to this for the first time, please consider hitting that subscribe button. YouTube, Spotify, Apple, those help us out the most, but wherever you consume this really helps us. And if you have done those things, tell people about us. Shout us out on Twitter. Quote, tweet us, retweet our promos on Twitter. But again, word of mouth goes a long way as well. And finally, join our Discord. The link to that is in our podcast and YouTube descriptions. Always good discussions going on there. And speaking of which, it was this discussion that inspired this podcast. I want to take a break from just talking about the everyday stuff and go macro here. But it's Alan in our Discord had essentially asked, why is the MVP debate so hotly contested in the NBA, seemingly, relative to other sports, where it doesn't become as vehement an issue in the NFL or MLB or NHL? And it was a fascinating question. I thought a lot about it. We had a lot of great response and different people weighed in. And I also think that this topic becomes like a little bit more relevant now. I mean, it's relevant because we're talking about it, but I'm not going to get into picks with Giannis versus Jokic versus Embiid versus Luka versus Tatum versus whoever else you have in there. But the news comes from Shams Charania of The Athletic that the NBA Players Union actually approached the league about maybe implementing a games minimum to be eligible for certain awards. We don't have the exact details on what awards that might entail. We don't have the exact details on whether that's going to, will it be all NBA as well? Will it be all defense? Is it for every single award? Is it only for certain awards? But the benchmark listed was 58 games. Now, to comment on that quickly, I'm not opposed to it. I understand what it does from a games played perspective. The league cares about load management and stars playing in as many games as possible. So it's more valuable. Well, I look at it and say, well, I'm going to prefer more total minutes played. If someone plays, I don't know, let's just say 2,000 minutes across 63 games, does that make them substantially more valuable than maybe someone who played like 1,600 across 53? I don't even, just throwing that out there. I think total minutes is a better reflection of a player's value, but from a league perspective, and a player's perspective, if they're worried about the season getting cut or their share being cut, you want to appear in as many games as possible because that's what the fans are ultimately there to say. You want to be able to purchase tickets in advance. And yes, is Steph or Giannis or Luka or Jokic more likely to play in every game if they need to hit 58, as many games as possible, if they need to hit 58 to be eligible for an award? That's not, look, Jokic is an Iron Man. Doncic has played in a ton of games normally. I'm just saying that's why the games played benchmark is in place. It's not really about, to me, it has nothing to do with sort of rationalizing the awards discourse. It's more about, hey, we want to figure out this load management issue, which is not a player issue, to be clear. That's teams are in control of that, and they're probably trying to ensure that their players are as well rested as possible for the games that matter most. I assume there's a whole bunch of medical staff that are involved in making this decision, and that they've probably looked at research or historical results or vitals, and they've come to this decision. It's not the players alone, most of whom I would argue 99.9% of players always want to play. Go figure. Now, but so again, why do we care so much about the MVP award in the NBA? And I do think it's a shit ton of factors. And I think first and foremost, where I land is that when you look across these four major sports, I do think that the NBA is the one where a singular player can have the most transformative impact. And you are playing both sides of the ball. And that, for one, makes it easier to separate from football. Two, you're also dealing with only one MVP here, whereas in baseball, we're talking about AL versus NL. And then also, so like having to narrow down that field even further, I think absolutely matters as well. The bigger thing is, though, and is even in baseball, you look at this in football, if we're going to name the QB the most valuable player, can they have that profound impact on the team where if all you have is Aaron Rodgers, you're not guaranteed to be one of the 3 to 5 best teams in the league or a legitimate threat to win every game or be just a contender to be put in that level. In the NBA, you can get there. We've seen it with LeBron. We've seen it with Giannis. We've seen it with Jokic. And yes, there are star pairings, but you're talking about one, playing both sides of the ball, which I know that they do in baseball and hockey as well. Hockey's interesting too, because it doesn't seem like it's as contentious a debate. I just wonder if what also contributes to that is the NBA in North America is going to be more popular. And so there's going to be more people invested in that interest. But digressing to all these variety of factors, I think the bigger one is, though, you look at all of these sports, baseball, where, pitchers, they're not, depending on the game, like they're not actually batting at all. So they're not having they're not having any impact on the offense in some games. Or even if you are, like, you're getting one at bat every 9 players. And so you're not having the consistent offensive impact. You're not having an offensive impact every single inning, no matter who you are. And also splitting it up from the offense and defense, having AL versus NL MVP, having the Cy Young Award winner. Even in the NFL, they name this is Rookie of the Year. They have the offensive and defensive player Rookie of the years. The NBA doesn't separate it like that. And so, like, even the Rookie of the Year debate can, in theory, and it rarely becomes contentious. I think the last one that was like a big deal was it like the Malcolm Brogdon versus Joel Embiid one, maybe. So like, but again, not having that separation definitely contributes to it. The other thing too is that players are more recognizable in this sport. The league has very much built, Rhett Bauer pointed this out in the Discord, that there are fans of players, not necessarily of teams. There are fans of teams, but there are fans of players that follow. I have one of my best friends in life is a LeBron James fan. He just roots for whatever team LeBron James is on. There are those fans in football, I'm sure. I know there are plenty of Tom Brady fans in football, but I do think on the NBA, it's at a different scale. And even if they meant to do it or not this way, where I don't know that they wanted to just create fans of players, but they definitely wanted to build up and market around their stars, which they've done. And you can more easily do that too, because they are just going to be inherently more recognizable. Baseball, wearing hats and helmets. Football, you're wearing helmets. Hockey, you're wearing helmets. And so these guys aren't as front facing as they are, as they would be in the NBA, the WNBA as well. Like, you're seeing them, even if it wasn't about marketing around the actual players, you're seeing them. And I think that develops a different type of connection, as does the fact that you're dealing also with a smaller roster number. So like the NBA, I'm not including people who could be dressed, but like the NBA, you're going to have active roster spots that are barely more than a dozen. And so you're looking at 15, I think is the number. Did they ever elevate it to 16? I should know that number. It was 15. How many active roster spots in the NBA? I believe it's 15. I don't know why. Yeah, 15. I don't know why I thought because the two-way players so it's 7. Let's call it 17. That's the number that's screwing me up there. So you're talking about 17. In baseball, that number is going to be in the 20s. In football, that number is in the 50s. In hockey, hockey's weird. It's like, I think you can have 20 players maybe that can dress, but you can give up to like a shit ton of contracts when you're factoring in the different levels of hockey. So just by virtue, though, when you're talking about the active roster, even if they're not suiting up every night, like the rosters are just inherently smaller, and you only have 5 players on the court at the same time. And there aren't these line changes like there are in, forget about football here, where they're splitting the sides of the ball, but in basketball, like, there's not these line changes that there are in hockey. You have teams where it's like, okay, these guys are going to log a shit ton of minutes. And if, you're a fan of the Toronto Raptors, let's say, like, that Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet are going to log, if they're healthy, like 37, 38 minutes a game or whatever it is. And so you're spending more time just on the court in general. And so I do think all of those factors kind of, they contribute to I don't want to say a deeper connection, but more of an investment in the storylines surrounding these actual players. And I don't know that you're always going to have that in all of these other sports. What I also think is that the NBA has also kind of designed it this way. When you really think about it, to date, there's been no criteria. And like, look, the games played thing, it's not really like it's like, it gives you a benchmark, but is anyone who was playing in fewer than 58 games to begin with really going to win MVP in a full-on season? Yeah, I would argue probably not. And that's a different discussion to be had, and we'll probably get to it later. But just knowing that 5 players are going to be on the court for 75% of the game or more. Like, if you're talking about in Pascal Siakam's case, like, he's on the court for more than 75% of the game every night. Not saying he's in the MVP discussion, but so there's that element as well. And the NBA has, it's engendered this debate by not having the criteria in general. And I don't think, like I said before, the 58 games is going to clear that up in any way. I mean, if you thought that, like, let's use an example. Kyrie Irving, as I'm recording this, is playing 51 games. And so if he was in theory in the MVP discussion, yeah, I guess it would be like, oh, he really has to, like, or Luka's at 57. So they were going to shut him down for the rest of the regular season for some reason, or Dame at 54. That could impact their place in the MVP voting, but they're going to get there. There's enough of the season where they're going to get there. And like in the case of LeBron James, where he's probably not going to get there, he's at 47 games played. That probably fucks with his all NBA chances if you set that benchmark. And so that's what I probably wouldn't be a fan of, is because I like the idea. Value to me is different than all NBA. When you're looking at MVP versus all NBA, I mostly like to reward, yes, availability is part of the equation, but it's a smaller part of the equation for me. I want to reward a more outstanding player. And so like LeBron, I think would have a chance if you're going to play in more than half your games or get to 50 and like you were just super outstanding this season. I don't, if people are going to put him on their all NBA teams, I have not gone through this yet. So please, nobody get mad at the moment. That's not going to make me, angry or lose sleep. Whereas if you did vote him for MVP, then it's just like, okay, well, part of value is availability. It's not just being outstanding. You're trying to encompass more. Maybe that's inconsistent thoughts on my process, but that's where I land there. But the NBA has created this ambiguity. There is no criteria. Not that there's criteria across all these other leagues, but just that ambiguity coupled with everything else. And the other thing that I don't know that we give enough consideration to is that the NBA, relative to MLB, relative to NFL, and I would say relative to NHL. I'm actually not too familiar with like their content sharing guidelines, but the NBA's made their content more accessible and they've really pushed the social media element. NFL is a beast. College football is probably even more popular than the NBA. I would think anyway. I'm sorry, I'm not up to college football ratings, but like you have them constantly, these players, these highlights on social media, and you're distilling these highlights down. You're taking them and you're digesting them. You're seeing quotes from players across social media. And the fact that the NBA is just so ubiquitous on social media and that they drive these, it's not just about play on the court, but you're driving these storylines and narratives and like the way that debate shows are set up. And yeah, they're going to talk about other sports in the same vein, but this is then connected with a league where they're very much promoting not rivalries, but like you're going to see inflammatory quotes elevated, or you're just going to see these highlights elevated, and they're giving out consistently and publicizing, like highlighting consistently, players of the week versus players of the month. And I think that's going to again contribute to people's emotional investment in the discussion. I would need to see this. I'm not plugged into enough of other sports Twitters, but when you have executives and employees really shilling for certain players, like we know Daryl Morey and going on his Joel Embiid campaign on Twitter, or what the Rockets did with Daryl Morey way back when for James Harden. I don't know if there's that level of propaganda across other sports. As someone else also pointed out in our Discord, like the NBA GOAT debate feels like more of a thing. And so like when you care so much about the status of individual players, yeah, you have that in football with the QB. But do we have the same thing in baseball? Like, I guess that conversation happens tangentially, but is it because so many options to choose from, or it's harder to reach a consensus there? Is it just overwhelmingly in favor when you're looking at the NHL? Is it just Wayne Gretzky? I don't even know the answer to. Like, I'm just throwing the name out there. So you're already invested in like these all-time debates, and so why wouldn't these single season awards matter a great deal to you? And you're also, from season to season, like the MVP award specifically drives so much of that agenda, whether it's just in the GOAT debate or a player's place in the larger pantheon of the sport. And it's almost not that it's replaced, but like we don't really view all-star berths. I feel like we still do, but we don't view them in that same vein like we used to. They feel a little bit less valuable. And so if you're going to detract value from another area, you're going to replace it, or it's going to be inflated elsewhere. And then what also can contribute to that is we've gotten a lot more information in recent years, and it's become a lot easier to separate player performances from the overarching performance of their team and to contextualize it. It's not just, yes, looking at, let's use last year as an example, or even, Russ's MVP. Kevin Durant leaves and look at the group that he dragged to 6 in the West, or with Jokic, didn't have Murray, Porter misses a bunch of time. Look at what he was able to do with that Nuggets team. Yes, that was always part of it, that narrative. But like we can really separate down to there's on-off numbers, how teams are faring with and without players, how they're faring in certain lineups, how the team's individual statistics, not just the team's individual statistics are with a player versus on off, but also how that player's impact on the players around him. With, as an example, players that are shooting better with Nikola Jokic on the court, who are more efficient with Nikola Jokic on the court individually, not as a team. And so being able to look at that, to have that data just readily available, I think it makes it easier to then devalue winning as part of it. And that's why, we saw someone like team winning, because wins aren't a player stat. That's how you get an instance where Russell Westbrook wins MVP, Jokic wins MVP. And it's not commenting on, oh, their team didn't win enough, they didn't deserve it. But I think that there's more of and I'm not saying this is the right or wrong way. I do lean towards defaulting to best player on the best team is kind of an oversimplification of this award. But when you have so much information available and the ability to separate player performances versus their team's overall performance, it can create situations where, let's use Damian Lillard or Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. One of those two guys is going to make first team All NBA. One of those guys, if not both, they're all likely going to be on a team that's below 500. This year specifically might speak to the parity of the game, but we're able to separate that player's impact from his team's record. And I think because, and I'm not saying that doesn't necessarily happen in other sports, but because we're taking that in tandem with the fact that one player can have this huge impact relative to other sports where either they're not playing both sides of the ball, or they're just not spending as much time on the court, or there's only so much that they can do from a singular position. And in football, it's like, yeah, QB can really define your entire offense. Can't do that for your defense, aside from limiting the amount of time, I guess, that they have to spend on the field. And so, yes, QB can have a transformative impact on offense. Can't do that on defense. Someone in Giannis in the NBA, and this is not for better, it's for better or better. I'm not saying the NBA is superior to the NFL. It's my favorite sport. The basketball is my favorite sport. That's why I have covered it for as long as I have. But this is not a critique of how other sports operate. It's just that someone like Giannis is going to can have a huge impact, be the most valuable. We've seen it. He was the MVP and the defensive player of the year at one point. And so you can't have that in the NFL. You can't even have that. I guess in theory, Ohtani could win Cy Young and AL MVP or a Triple Crown award. I just don't. Basketball is so different in that regard to me. And then, as my co-host Grant had pointed out when he was delivering his response to this, another thing is how much harder it is to judge value in basketball overall than baseball. He said, this is a quote, "The latter is basically perfect. Baseball is basically perfect conditions for quantitative analysis. Pitches and at-bats are singular, similar, and repeatable. They're static and super easy to compare across players. Basketball is dynamic and has a zillion more complicating variables, so there's just more room for debate. A baseball player's value can be judged without considering teammates or situation. Not so easy for basketball." And I think this brings up the eye test versus analytics debate a little bit here, whether inadvertently or not, from Grant. Is in the NBA, you can look at numbers, both catch-all, the granular, the shooting percentages, scoring numbers, on-off rating. But then you can also say, okay, well, I look at this player and I feel his impact. It's like Draymond Green's defense. Anyone who watches Draymond Green on a regular basis knows what his value is to the Warriors. But if you just look at his stat line and you're not watching him consistently or on a nightly basis or just a bunch of his games every single year, you're going to see, 6 points, 7 assists or something like what is that actually doing? And there's more context needed in basketball, at least than compared to baseball. And maybe you can even, you look at baseball and it's just like, yeah, okay, this guy has his swing. The aesthetics look really good, but his batting average or his on-base percentage or his slugging percentage is just in the toilet. His team isn't necessarily impacting that. I guess you could say, well, who is he batting behind or in front of? How does that change the type of pitches he sees? What's situationally? How many times is he up where there's no runners in scoring position? Does that change the way that he's approaching his at-bat? Well, yeah, those are definitely going to factor into some decision-making, but it's more binary than it is for basketball. Again, not saying basketball is just superior there from that. And so there's just so much room for interpretation in the NBA than there is for other sport, than there is in, let's use baseball specifically, with a player's value. And you're combining that with the fact they are going to have, yes, baseball, you can have an impact on both sides of the field, but the field is just so big and it's at a standstill that you can't control in any way how your teammates are defending because you're playing first base. And yes, you can really snag errant throws and still get outs or, save errors from happening. But like you can't elevate the play of those around you as much as you can in basketball, or even I would say hockey, just like those around you can't necessarily devalue your play as much. Yes, they can, but it just feels like in MLB it's happening on a smaller scale. In the NFL, it's happening in more of a vacuum because of how the sides of the ball are separated. And I don't know, and I go back to the roster spot thing too, is I just wonder if there would be more investment in to the NFL. Even let's just say, like, yes, the NFL MVP. Like, would there be more investment in the NFL MVP award if there were fewer roster spots, or if it didn't really almost default to? It feels like a position at this point when it's QB. In the NBA, it hasn't necessarily defaulted to that singular position. I think one of the final things I considered is that the NBA regular season just might be, this could be evidence that it's just so long um, that we need other conversations to occupy us properly. MLB would probably have the same issue, but they have so many roster spots. Again, it's going to just not dilute the MVP field, but I think it changes the context of the conversation, as does splitting it up by league and side of the ball. But like they also have fewer playoff spots. And so like every game, not, I guess do I say it matters more than every single regular season game in the NBA? Just because if we're looking at it through the lens of the play-in tournament, yes, you have 20 teams of the 30 in the league that are going to make the playoffs. So yeah, more of them in theory have more to compete for. But when you're actually looking at getting into the postseason, being in the meat and potatoes of the playoffs, the MLB is going to have fewer playoff spots, and you're still going to have teams that are in tight contests with one another. And how does series change that? Just you're seeing teams play each other more often, so maybe there's more investment there. But I think that when you're talking about in MLB as well, when you're talking about the field of contenders in the NBA, even with that 20 playoff field, it's almost thinner than it would be in an MLB, in the NFL, where there's a scarcity of product, to be sure. But in the NHL, where it feels like there's going to be more upsets because of just the way that games are decided by such these thin margins, where yes, in the NFL, it's just a one-off thing. A superior team can have a bad game, and then you're out of the playoffs. Then in the NHL and MLB, yes, you're dealing with best of 7 series, and I don't know the statistics behind this, but I would argue like, yes, the superior team or the better team coming in is probably going to win most of the time. That being said, games are decided by these 1-point goals, these 1-run scores. And yes, in MLB, you can hit a grand slam and there's 4 runs right there, but the margins of victory are so much thinner that it's going to open the door for more upsets. And so you can have a regular season that's just as long, like in hockey, or a regular season that's longer, like in baseball, and it might not feel as meaningless as it's been devalued in basketball. And it's also, hockey's super physical, so I don't want to say this, but maybe with the line changes, and if you're going to have your ice time is fewer than 40 minutes every single night, does allow you to play in more games. In baseball, though, like, it definitely seems less physically demanding, just because there's a lot of time that you're spending at a standstill. So you're going to be able to play in more games. This is easier to separate value for players when you've already broken down the award into 2 separate tiers in that regard. And so I do think there are all of those overarching factors that come down to it, where a lot of it to me really is the nature of the sport, the nature of the schedule. But I also do firmly believe that the NBA has created this by, if not design, by just the nature of how they try to promote the sport and their players. And that's ultimately fine. I have a real problem with the MVP discourse when it turns into a pissing contest or shitting over one candidate to prop up the next. And I actually can't recall. I don't think I ever did this. Maybe I probably did. I did this when you're younger, and like you're using, and if you're a fan, of course, using you're going to use numbers or anecdotal evidence to prop up your candidate versus someone else. And there's that intrinsic desire to compare and contrast, which I get, and there's a place for it. But it feels like there are so many people that live and die on singular arguments, or at least they're unwilling to admit that, hey, this is complicated. And so this year's MVP debate specifically, and even last year's MVP debate, I think Jokic should have won. Yes, this year Jokic could win, probably will win. That doesn't mean that he's the only right answer to me. A lot of people paint this as it's him, and that's it at this point. First of all, there's like 15 games left to play, and Joel Embiid has been absolutely dominant. The Bucks are really coming along under the way that Giannis has played. He goes through a little bit of a slump. There's ebbs and flows to a season, and I do think we all need to keep more of an open mind. We also absolutely need to be prepared to have the conversation about implicit racial bias. Do I agree with the way that Kendrick Perkins went about it by using points per game as the crux of his argument? No, I think you could talk. There's an inherent scoring bias. Look at the Sixth Man of the Year award winner. There's an inherent bias already to the offensive production in general, but we're talking about a sport that is dominated by that is like we're talking about a sport that has a ton of black talent. Like it's a sport that is dominated by black players. And when you have, again, ESPN came out, retracted, there is more of a diverse voting pool, media pool than Perkins initially intimated at, but you do as let's use myself as just a white media member, you have to at least ask yourself, like, could I be at least acknowledge that there is implicit racial bias at play just in general, not even saying that you necessarily ascribe to it. You don't automatically have to get defensive, and you could go, yeah, and maybe you should just keep that in mind, or at least acknowledging as much as you're going about making your picks. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We have to be prepared to have the discussion when it's a league like this. And I think it makes some people uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable to talk about. I do like listening to it though. And I want to keep an open mind as I go through these different types of things. I don't know that that's necessarily why the MVP award in the NBA feels like it matters so much more, but that's just another element to the levels of investment in this debate, especially it seems like this season. But I don't like when it's just boiled down to something that's so binary, as I mentioned before. This isn't ones and twos. This isn't, it has to be so-and-so, and there's no alternative choice. In a lot of years, I'm sure that it could have went to 1, 2, or 3 people. And in my personal opinion, there's 3, perhaps 4 that I would accept as, okay, I see the argument for them. And if you're going to make the argument for them. I'm not necessarily going to agree, but I don't think I would call you egregious if you vote. I wouldn't call you egregious if you vote for Giannis. Giannis might be my first pick at this point when all said and done, just seeing how the season kind of closes this year. So I hope that the MVP debate can at least get a little bit more productive. And I do think everyone's probably guilty of adding to the toxicity in some level. There are some that definitely seem worse than others, but just between the propagandizing coming from teams and executives and even just fans and trainers, where it's not just about propping up their guy, it's creating a scenario where they're either denigrating someone else, using anecdotal evidence that doesn't even make any sense. And one of the big things is like Jokic needs to do it in the playoffs is his. And I'm not necessarily coming to his defense here. The last time the Nuggets were fully healthy, he went to the Western Conference Finals. Zach Lowe also mentioned this on his podcast, and I've been driving home the point that Jokic's individual numbers in the playoffs are really good. But you look at Embiid's and Jokic's playoff numbers individually are just going to look better than Embiid's. Yes, you can factor defense into the equation, but like we act like there's some huge separation between one candidate or the other when oftentimes there's not. Yeah, there can be years where it's just, Steph Curry had the unanimous MVP in 2016. There are absolutely years where it's like that. But more and more as we have more information, as the league gets deeper, as we're not necessarily, I don't want to say waiting team success, but at least being able to incorporate different elements of information that's available to us, these races are going to get more complicated. And so in one way, I kind of embrace the complexity, but I really hate watching and listening to people try to boil it down to this just either or proposition when it's not always that simple, where it's player X like is worse than player Y. Like that's how it's not, this is why player Y is my pick. It's player X is better than player Y. And that's why player Y shouldn't win is how it almost feels a lot of the time. And that could be, this is going to be, debate shows are going to have these conversations about, I'm not going to confess to watch, these hockey debates, or I've definitely seen NFL GOAT debates or MVP debates, but MLB MVP debates. Yeah, the debate shows are going to have those types of conversations regardless. The nature of those conversations is going to be the same regardless. But in the NBA in particular, excuse me, as I have a hiccup there, since I mentioned before that so much of its model is rooted in its reach on social media and attracting attention and fandom and evoking interest in a span of clips. It feels like that analysis, if we see something from ESPN or Fox Sports or just someone talking on a podcast, where you see it all the time with people clipping Bill Simmons, like the recordings on their phone, they're putting these snippets up and it feels like it spreads more because that's like how basketball fandom is kind of it's not the genesis of it, but it's part of its fabric. And so you're going to information is disseminated more in that way, and then it spreads more quickly in that way. This is just my opinion based off no studies whatsoever. And I don't know if because of the nature of of the way that the league has promoted itself on social media and the way that these debates are, this is all part of it. It's like stacking one on top of the other. We've got a Russian nesting doll situation, maybe. I don't know if that's the right way to frame it, or a domino effect or buildup effect, whatever. But because stuff spreads on social media like that, because it's because engagement is generated that way, you have more of an incentive to talk about this in the first place. But it also creates this cycle of, well, are we hate listening or hate watching? And it's like, yeah, I dunk on things that I disagree with on Twitter all the time, and they're from shows that I won't even regularly watch just because I don't play stock in them. And I don't know that I ever did, but certainly not now. But yet it's out there on social media and it's going to spread. And like my tone is very tongue in cheek, where I'm not going to take it too seriously, but there are people that take it really seriously. And that's, again, I'm not even criticizing that, but I think the investment there into the social media, to the very clippy nature of the way this league is covered, that's going to contribute to this debate. And so if maybe you disagree and you think that the MVP, maybe I'm too in my NBA basketball bubble about this, so feel free to get at me there. But that's the only thing I wanted to tackle. And I thought it was topical given the fact that the league changing that 58, considering the Players Union League talking about that 58 game minimum for awards. I wonder if that will have a material impact on the way that the awards are actually picked. And the only thing that I could see it changing is, I guess it could increase a player's desire to be available for a certain amount of time, but I'm wondering, would it actually make voters more open to voting for someone who has only appeared in 58 or 59 games because that number is there? Whereas right now, I don't think, and there's just like, look, there's not a candidate that's really going to fall under this umbrella. So any example I say here is like going to kind of suck. But let's just, as an example, Luka Doncic plays in 2 more games the rest of the year, and the Mavs win both of them. They climb up the Western Conference standings, whatever. He'll be at 59 games played. Are you going to be, I don't think you would vote for him this season if you're talking about your other options, which would have been primarily if you're looking at as a good example here, like how many games is, they're not even on the minutes thing. So Embiid, he's actually been in fewer games than Luka at this point. But if Embiid had played 63, 65 versus Luka's 59, if Jokic is going to play in, this is probably, it could definitely in this regard, Jokic is in 60 games played right now. If he finishes with 70 versus Luka at 59, I don't think that Luka would beat Jokic. If that was just the two, if those were the two candidates, it's not. That's not how it's breaking down. Does this invite more of that though, or more consideration for a Luka in this case, where it would be okay, like he reached the minimum. Why are you even citing it anymore? You could cite that Jokic played all these more minutes, but Luka hit the 58 game minimum. Why shouldn't he be considered? And so maybe it could change the way awards are voted for in that regard. I can't really picture it having this material impact. And in turn, if it doesn't, is it going to have this meaningful dent on player availability for teams? Because teams will not fuck with the things that they won't do, or at least if Ja Morant was going to make an all NBA team and he was available for the Grizzlies right now, which he's not, he's checked into a counseling facility. I don't know why we need to know the location. I hope he's fine and gets all the help he needs and comes back. And I wish nothing but the best for him. But getting the location of it was weird, by the way. The side tangent there. But just as Ja Morant, if he makes all NBA this year, like his contract gets elevated to supermax, teams aren't going to bench players in general if they have that much money on the line. That would be just catastrophic for player team relationships, where it'd be like if this was last year and Shea was going to make an all NBA team so that the all NBA contract bump would have come into play. The Thunder aren't even doing that now. They're talking about monitoring his ab injury, but they wouldn't even do that now. He's on track to make an all NBA team this season. They're not going to do anything to jeopardize that. So if teams are already thinking that way, what does the 58 game minimum really do? Does it make it more likely then that if it was LeBron and he had to come back, the Lakers are going to rush him? No, unless there's contract incentives at play, I don't really know how much of a difference that makes from a player and team thinking perspective of like, oh, I need to get out there and play. Not that players don't want to play again, but unless we get to a point where it's, oh, they hit that 58 game minimum, so I'm going to vote for them. And we actually have a 59 game over an 82 game season. He won the MVP award. And so now my incentive is, yeah, like he was probably going to play 51, but he's going to really get to that 58 game mark. And so I'll be interested to see if there's any material change there. I still think we should value total minutes played more than anything. And I also don't know that the total playing time needs to matter as much in the All-NBA. When you miss as many games as Zion Williamson has this season, for example, okay, like, yes, he shouldn't be eligible for All-NBA, and he's not going to make All-NBA. But, LeBron, if he gets to 50 appearances and, like, his minutes are still up there, where I don't even know why he's played as many minutes as he has this season, but you're talking about him averaging over 36 minutes per game at the in his age 38 season. And even as of now, if the season ended today, like, he's going to be at 1,700 minutes. That's not an insubstantial sample size. So that's really on that, though, why I think the MVP discussion matters more and is more toxic and evokes more emotion and response, it seems, anecdotally at least, in the NBA than it does compared to other sports. If you followed me this rant this long, please remember to subscribe. If you haven't already, tell people about us, word of mouth, retweet us, shout us out on Twitter. Any thoughts at all, hit us in the Discord. The link to that is in the podcast and YouTube description. And you can follow us on the socials at HardwoodKnocks on Twitter and TikTok, at Hardwood_Knocks on Instagram. I will note I do put up unique content across all of TikTok and Instagram. So go ahead and follow those accounts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, the whole nine. Appreciate every single one of you as always. And until next time, I leave you with the shout out to the one, the only, the indelible, the real MVP, if we're being honest, Frank Ntilikina.